The Lord Bishop of Gloucester.
My Lords, it is a privilege and a great honour to introduce this debate today. My thanks to all of the noble lords who've agreed to contribute, and I'm especially grateful that Baroness Sater has chosen to make her maiden speech. And I know that her extensive experience in business, in the charitable sector, and her time working with the Youth Justice Board and as a magistrate will inform many excellent contributions to this House. I look forward to hearing her today. My own interest in this issue flows not least from my experience in the Diocese of Gloucester, which has one of the country's 12 women's prisons, HMP Eastwood Park, as well as having the Women's Centre run by Nelson Trust, whose work is exemplary. I'm now supporting the Bishop of Rochester in his role as Bishop to Her Majesty's prisons with regards to the female estate. And I also recently visited Anawim, the superb women's centre in Birmingham. As a Christian, I believe that our humanity and flourishing is rooted in relationship. I also believe that transformation is possible, both within the lives of individuals and of systems, and I'll come back to these themes. The number of women in prison is approximately 4,000. It's about 5% of the total prison population. And whilst this is a relatively small percentage, these women present a distinct set of needs, and their imprisonment has a significant impact on communities and society as a whole. The long-awaited female offender strategy recognises the vulnerabilities and challenges of women in prison, and it builds on the tireless work done by the noble lady Baroness Corsten. And I'd like to express my sincere thanks to her and also to all those who've contributed to this offender strategy, not least Dr. Philip Lee prior to his resignation. However, I fear that 11 years after the Corsten report, the strategy simply does not go far enough. We know that women's centres work, and it's time for proper investment. I'd like to return to those themes of relationship and transformation. People of all ages thrive and flourish on healthy, loving relationships. Unfortunately, the majority of women offenders have experienced some sort of abuse, whether from a partner or family member. According to that excellent organisation, Women in Prison, 53% of women in prison report having experienced physical, emotional or sexual abuse during childhood. 46% report having suffered domestic violence, and over 30% have spent time in local authority care as a child. Where healing and rehabilitation takes place, it comes from a place of trust in relationship. As a member of the clergy, I've often been trusted with people's most intimate personal information, and it usually takes a strong relationship of trust for a woman to discuss an abusive relationship or a problem with drugs or alcohol or a mental health problem. To that end, prison is rarely the most appropriate or effective place for these issues to be addressed, not least because so many women are assigned short sentences. On the other hand, a short stay in prison can dramatically affect a woman's relationship with her children, harming both the mother and child. And of course, that has an impact on the wider community. I'm particularly grateful to the research of Dr. Shona Minson and all she is doing to inform magistrates and judges. Women's centres provide an opportunity for a different path. The Nelson Trust recently shared Sue's story with me. Sue was sentenced to 8 months for theft. She'd been taking cash from the shop where she worked in order to pay off her debts and fund her alcohol and drug addiction. She had a painful history, and her daughter had been taken into foster care. While Sue was in prison, she was fortunate enough to make contact with the Nelson Trust, and she began to develop a trusting relationship. So when she came out of prison, Nelson Trust worked with Sue. They obtained rented accommodation for her, and she also began participating in various courses, including crime and its impact, preventing relapse, and self-esteem and confidence building. When Sue was investigated for another offence, committed at the time of her initial offence, she immediately admitted it and was supported by her key worker through meetings with solicitors and another trip to court. She pleaded guilty, and the Women's Centre were able to give the court a full picture of how Sue had been engaging with services. Instead of going back through that revolving door of prison and risking undoing months of hard work, Sue was given a community order with unpaid work hours, many now spent at the Women's Centre, where she is making a difference in the lives of other women. Sue has not used drugs since she left prison 18 months ago, and Nelson Trust is supporting her towards potential future contact with her daughter. This example shows that women's centres can give judges and magistrates the information they need to make effective sentencing decisions and give women the tools they need to truly transform their lives. None of this would be possible without the relationship Sue has with the Women's Centre, doing things with her and not to her. This is just one of many stories from the Nelson Trust and Anawim. I'm grateful that the Noble Lord Farmer will be conducting an independent review into how we can better support female offenders' relationships with their families. Yet it's all too frequent that magistrates do not have informative probation reports before sentencing. Action must be taken to review how women interact with the justice system and how women are sentenced, particularly by magistrates. It may be that a presumption against short sentences, as in the Scottish system, would be desirable, particularly given the fact that in 2017, almost half of women were given a short custodial sentence for shop theft. We know that women get caught in the so-called revolving door with short prison sentences. Women lose their homes, they often lose custody of their children, even to adoption. And this often exacerbates that downward spiral into more serious offences and an inability to secure employment. This is why there needs to be a focus on women's centres. In their daily provision and, where possible, appropriate residential provision, they can provide that place of relationship and trust. Properly resourced women's centres can provide everything from early intervention right through to supporting a woman through the entire criminal justice system. And for women who are already in prison, centres such as Nelson Trust and Anawim have teams who engage with women in prison and then through the gate. This is not simply about tackling the presenting offending, the what, but rather providing a holistic, trauma-informed approach which focuses on the why. Caseworkers in a place of relationship focus on getting to the heart of the women's story in order to address what are often complex needs. There have been a number of reports to show that women's centres offer an inspiring and effective alternative to custody, not least in their multi-agency work. But they have been operating on a shoestring, and at present there simply isn't enough resource. If the government is committed to transforming the justice system, as this female offender strategy suggests, they need to commit and invest in it. We know it costs approximately £47,000 a year to keep a woman in prison, and yet we know that women's centres can work effectively with approximately £4,000 per year per individual. Moreover, the benefits of women's centres are multiplied if they can operate as a network so that women can stay close to their families. If we don't have a whole network of women's centres, we won't see the fruit of provision. And I'd like to encourage the government to dream a bit bigger and be a bit bolder. Similarly, I hope that all parties will commit to properly funding this network. In 2017 to 18, we spent more than £400 million on probation and services for women. £5 million for women's centres is a drop in the bucket and won't be enough to transform the system. Let's give a proper network of women's centres a proper go. Shortly after Dr. Philip Lee's resignation, when the female offender strategy was published, he shared his concerns regarding the failure to secure all the funding required. He also made it clear that he had full faith in the Secretary of State to navigate the government's spending review in order to benefit vulnerable women caught up in the criminal justice system. I am hugely encouraged by this and the appointment of Ed Arger, and I look forward with hope to see the funding for women's centres secured. There need to be enough women's centres, they need to be appropriately funded so that magistrates and the public can trust that women's centres can improve outcomes to the justice system. I hope the government will back this strategy with vision and proper investment and with a focus on relationship and transformation.
I congratulate the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, for securing this debate. I was absolutely delighted when she was appointed Bishop to women's prisons. It's a post that she's embraced with commitment and enthusiasm. My Lords, there are currently just under 4,000 women in our prisons. They serve short sentences. In 2016, 271 of them served sentences of less than 2 weeks. 45% of those on remand do not get a custodial sentence. And 6 weeks on remand is long enough to lose both home and children and often get neither back. Nearly 3/4 of them have a mental health condition. Their addictions encompass alcohol, subscription and illegal substances, and sometimes a combination of all three. At least half of them are victims of sexual and domestic violence, and they are 30 times more likely than women in the general population to commit suicide on release. In 2016, 22 women took their lives in our prisons, the highest number for years. Their self-harm rates are shocking, and every year 17,000 children are affected by their mother's imprisonment. My Lords, these women are troubled, not troublesome. Prison does not and cannot do anything for them. My report was published 11 years ago in 2007. I recommended our present women's prisons should be closed, that we should have a network of women's centres and small custodial units. There was a handful of centres in 2006, and when Jack Straw was the Home Secretary, £15.6 million was committed as seed court money to build a network of women's centres, and there are now over 50. The reduction in the subsequent numbers of women in prison enabled the following government to close 2 women's prisons and save a lot of money. Centres have admirable recidivism rates, which were acknowledged by the Ministry of Justice a couple of years after my report. Centres deal with all the issues arising from these women's chaotic lives, all under one roof. Debt, mental health, addiction, parenting, abuse, cooking. And it is harder than being in prison. Let no one think this is a soft option. I remember visiting a centre and meeting a woman who was 41. She had been in and out of trouble with the police since she was 15 years old. I asked her why she was there, and she said, well, some magistrate had realised it was pointless to keep sending her to prison. She said she'd forgotten how many times she was in prison, but every time she'd been in prison, there was someone she could blame. If my mother had protected me, if my stepfather hadn't done that to me, if I hadn't had to run away from home, if I hadn't been pimped into prostitution, if I hadn't become a drug addict, if I hadn't started assaulting people in the street for money. She said every single time I could blame someone else. And she said, coming here, the centre has challenged me and said, but what is your role? What have you done that makes you end up here? Losing 2 of your children to adoption without consent and the possibility of living with your little boy of 3. And I asked her what the experience had been, and she said to me, it is much, much harder than being in prison. And I asked her a question I often ask these women in prison, which a lot of people think is a ridiculous question. I said, have you always liked yourself? And she said, no. And I asked, do you like yourself now? And she thought about it for a bit and said, yes. I said, in that case, you're going to be all right. I was listening to Weekend Women's Hour about 7 years ago on a Saturday afternoon, and there was an item about women who'd been in women's centres. There were 2 of them. They were asked about what happened, and they said that on reception they had to fill in a form which they thought was total rubbish. The form asked questions like, what did you want to be when you grew up? Are your children proud of you? Are you still in touch with your school friends? They said, we thought this was rubbish. They went through the Women's Centre regime. One was in full-time education. The other one was in work, in her own accommodation with one of her children. And the interviewer asked the right last question. Those people who have worked as lawyers know that sometimes your last question can defeat your case. This interviewer asked the right last question. She asked, do you like yourself? Sorry, she asked, you told me that these forms were rubbish. What's happened to them? One had it on her fridge, and the other one had it on her bedroom wall. I think that illustrates what these women understood that those centres had done for them. When I was conducting my review, I did ask the number cruncher in the Home Office, that was the department then responsible for the women's estate, how much it cost, all costs, then, to keep a woman in prison for a year. And he told me £70,000. Now, at that time, a place in the Asher Centre in Worcester, which has since closed because of the effect of transforming rehabilitation, was £750 a year. I know which is the most effective. Unfortunately, transforming rehabilitation has had a dire effect on many women's centres. The contracts which community rehabilitation companies impose on them are oppressive, gagging clauses, £10,000 fees to alter a clause, and many, like Alana House in Reading, have stopped working with women offenders because they cannot comply with this regime. So we need this government to acknowledge the success of women's centres, to recognise that in Scotland they are doing exactly what I suggested and that it is working. And finally, may I wish the very best to Baroness Sato when she makes her speech.
My Lords, it is an honour and I'm most grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate today, which touches on many issues with which I have been closely aligned before coming to this House. Before doing so, though, I'd like to thank everyone in this House from all sides for their kindness and support. Black Rod and her staff, the doorkeepers, the attendants, and the police officers have been incredibly helpful and have given me so much guidance and direction. I cannot thank them enough. My induction into this House, although a nerve-wracking experience and a humbling one, was made less stressful by my wonderful supporters, the Lord Carrington of Fulham, who has been a friend and mentor to me for too many years to mention, and the noble lady, Baroness Chisholm of Olpen, who not only took on the role of my supporter, but wanted even more punishment to be my mentor. Thank you both, and I am truly grateful. I have been involved with the justice system for nearly a quarter of a century, much of it as a magistrate. One of the most difficult duties of a JP is where there is no alternative to send an offender to custody. It is not a decision that is taken lightly. This is particularly the case when imprisoning women because of the impact such a sentence has, not just on them, but all too often on their children and families. Nonetheless, in order to ensure that public safety remains a top priority and to address the rightful needs of victims, prison is and will continue to be the only appropriate option for those women who commit the most serious crimes. However, for other women offenders, those who commit the less serious and non-violent offences, there are alternatives. This is why I believe strongly in the ability of women's centres to improve the outcomes in the justice system. And I'm grateful to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, for introducing this debate. not least because we know that the reoffending rate after a custodial sentence of less than 12 months is far too high. All too often, I have seen at first hand, not only as a magistrate, but as a former trustee of Action, the impact on women and children of not having the start or support in life to help them with the many difficult challenges and trauma that comes from being victims of domestic abuse, sexual abuse and exploitation, or of suffering from poor mental health or addiction to drugs and alcohol. Regrettably and sadly, these circumstances often lead to a downward spiral into criminality. Women's centres provides the specialist treatment services to help precisely those women whose lives have taken a wrong turn and who need getting back on track. During a recent visit to the Nelson's Trust Women's Centre in Gloucester, it is evident that female offenders are frequently amongst the most vulnerable individuals in society with very complex needs. I was extremely impressed by the successes achieved as a result of the tireless work of those working at the Trust. There are many others like them who dedicate their lives to helping vulnerable women in need, and I pay tribute to them all. I therefore welcome the Government's decision to pilot residential women's centres. They will provide an additional option to manage women in the community on a sentence that is more intense and robust, but enables them to maintain their ties with their families and support them to stay in stable housing and employment. Such centres can provide the wide-ranging and holistic services that are now the norm for young offenders, both female and male. But of course, the ideal would be to tackle issues before they lead to criminality. During the 3 years I recently spent as a member of the board of the Youth Justice Board, I worked to improve early interventions and rehabilitation for children and give them an opportunity to live crime-free lives. One area which I believe offers great benefits and potential for both adult and child offenders to find new opportunities, as well as to improve their health and well-being, is sport. In my own case, tennis played a significant part in my childhood growing up in Wales. Playing competitively provided life skills and confidence from which I have benefited greatly, even if I was no Virginia Wade. In turn, I have been keen throughout my career to turn my personal sporting experience to the benefit of others, not least to provide similar opportunities to get on in life and to reach their full potential. It was through the Youth Justice Board, under the chairmanship of my friend, the Noble Lord McNally, that I was introduced to street games and subsequently became its chairman. The charity delivers sports into disadvantaged communities, giving children real opportunities to develop life skills, confidence, and eventually improve their prospects of employment. If we can help youngsters before they take the wrong turn, how much better off are they, and how much better off is society? For now, though, we must accept the reality that there are young and adult women who have, for whatever reason, committed offences. It behoves us to treat them as individuals and provide the most appropriate place to address their needs. Women's centres can and should play a critical part in their rehabilitation. It has been a privilege to contribute to the broad criminal justice system, whether as a magistrate working with those with addiction or affording opportunities through sport. It is an honour now to have the opportunity to play a role, however small, in your worship's house. Thank you.
My Lords, the House will need no convincing that my noble friend Baroness Sater has made an outstanding maiden speech, and we look forward to her further contributions in the weeks, the months, the years and the decades ahead. Her speech was based on personal experience, pragmatism, principle. She's got courage and she's got compassion. I've known her for some years, and I was absolutely delighted when I heard she was to come to this place. I think we will benefit greatly from her and all that she can offer. Being a Welsh national or a county tennis champion daunts me somewhat, but it suggests she has a great deal of stamina and power in her, and I think we should all beware as well as appreciating greatly her words. And I share much of her experience. I'm her experience at Addiction and the British Lung Foundation, important charities, the Youth Justice Board, with the Noble Lord, with the Metropolitan Police Authority, her commitment to street games, the Queen's Club Foundation, and most particularly as a magistrate. I was a magistrate for many years before I joined this place, another place, and had to step down because I didn't feel it was compatible to have a party political role as well as being chairman of a juvenile court in my case. But it really prepared one to understand the realities of life for those who were given a short straw, a chaotic upbringing, few resources and few champions in their life. And I think that will benefit us all as she continues to speak. Let me also join others in my congratulations to the Right Reverend Prelate. She will always be a heroine in my mind as being the first female Lord Spiritual to take her house in this place. She was a long time a coming, and as far as I'm concerned, she can do very little wrong. Just being here was such a triumph and a step forward. Now, this is, of course, an extraordinarily important debate on a critically sensitive subject. Many of the points have been made. 60% of female offenders suffer domestic abuse, substance abuse, mental illness, trauma, few role models, few champions. And of course, the appalling situation about women in the criminal justice system, and I pay tribute to the fact the numbers have fallen so far, 5% now of prisoners, 4,000 people. It was 17% at the beginning of the last century. But they do pay the double penalty. William Shakespeare said, "The sins of the father are laid upon the children." Well, this is the sins of the mother are laid upon the children. And those 17,000 children caught up in this pay a price that is not justified. I'm delighted that my noble friend Lord Farmer is reviewing Family Ties, the quarter of female offenders who got dependent children, and the shocking recidivism rates that have been mentioned, 70% compared with 62% for people who've been in prison for less than 12 months. And I think all of us feel that the Secretary of State for Justice in the female offender strategy holds out a great promise for recognising the issues involved in this uniquely complex group of people. And I, of course, bear great hope from the President of the Supreme Court, the first woman, Baroness Brenda Hale, who all those years ago, when I used to say we needed evidence base in the juvenile courts, I sat with a stipendiate who was always saying, in the public interest, some youngsters should be sent to detention centre. And I, as a social scientist, would say, what is the evidence that this is in the public interest when we know that 80% of these young people will reoffend within the year? So anyone who reads the President of the Supreme Court's Pakenham, Lord Longford lecture in 2005 will feel confident that her sensitivity for women and girls who fall foul of the criminal justice system is a great encouragement. And of course, women's centres are a great step forward, and I wouldn't in any way detract from them. The splendid Centre for Criminology at the University of Hull produced a report in 2015 by Brennan and Breen and Sturgeon Adams. They attributed great value in diverting low-severity female offenders from custody to a women's centre. The Together Women's Project in Sheffield evaluated that a 46% reduction in reoffending rate for women who attended their project over a 12-month follow-up period. We've talked about the huge cost of incarceration compared with the cost either of help in the community or of a women's centre. But it is the case that very often the women, like children, like others, who drift into the criminal justice system are those who've been failed by their own social services departments, their health departments, their education departments. And there's a real danger that the Ministry of Justice begins to pick up the cost that really the services in their home area should have been funding. I have long advocated a penalty on local authorities who have females or young people in a custodial provision, because there's a great deal of cost shunting. And those of you, other magistrates like myself, can remember that the social reports had little to offer. In other words, they needed to go to an institution to save the cost, the great cost, locally. And I think there are really serious financial components in how these decisions are made. But I do want to refer to three other organisations who I think make a splendid contribution. Working Chance, run by Jocelyn Hillman, is a recruitment agency. I declare an interest for helping people, female ex-offenders and care leavers. And it's extraordinary. Working Chance placed 200 women each year into quality paid work, maintaining a consistent reoffending rate of less than 3%. 85% of their candidates still in work after 6 months. So Jocelyn Hillman complains that too often women are described as victims. So what they really want, yes, is to feel stronger, but also they want paid work to restore their dignity in the community. Similarly, Pimlico Opera, Wasfi Carniv, or the Watts Gallery, who do artwork in prisons, helping people to grow in confidence, to excel, feel proud of their achievements. My Lords, this is a critically important debate. I believe we really are seeing progress. I welcome the government's commitment, and as the Minister knows, there are many in this House, and especially my noble friend Baroness Sater, who are going to be pushing for consistent progress.
I echo others who thank the Right Reverend Prelate for calling our attention to the important contribution that women's centres make in society today. And I'd also like to congratulate my noble friend for an excellent maiden speech. She will bring great energy and experience to this House. My Lords, we have around 3,800 women in our prisons, the vast majority held for non-violent offences, many of them on short-term sentences, many who go on to reoffend, and many who are mothers. A destructive and costly cycle for the victims, for the women involved, for their children, and for society as a whole. The reoffending rates alone are truly shocking. The Prison Reform Trust says 48% of women are reconvicted within a year of leaving prison, and this rises to 61% for sentences less than 12 months. Many of the women we speak of are amongst the most vulnerable in our society and face a range of problems: financial, homelessness, debt, dependency. 60% have experienced domestic abuse. 66% of them are also mothers, many in sole charge of their children. And what happens to these children when their mothers are sent to prison? Kate paradigm of women in prison suggests that only 5% of them remain in their own home. So a sentence for their mother often spells a broken home for her dependents. And evidence shows that the children of offenders are often more likely to go on to offend themselves, so entrenching the problem for future generations. My Lords, there will always be a balance between punishment, protection of the public, and rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. In the case of these women, we seem to be failing on all fronts. So it is right that we ask ourselves how best to break the cycle. This is a question the government's female offender strategy rightly seeks to answer, and I commend its ambition, and I welcome its support for women's centres. And I also look forward to hearing more from Lord Farmer on the strengthening of family ties, where fresh thinking would be welcome. But what of the solutions? Certainly, I would agree that short custodial orders should be a last resort, that we must seek alternatives where appropriate within the community, and in an ideal world, see fewer women coming into the justice system in the first place. But to make this a reality, we need to build a support structure around these women, especially when they are at their most vulnerable. And for many, this is at the point of release, where they might have no job or no home to return to. And it is here where I think women's centres have a great deal to offer and could no doubt do more, providing support over a wide range of issues, including sensitive ones like mental health, where women often feel reluctant to share too much with the criminal justice system. Recent evidence shows their worth. Recent data from the Ministry of Justice on reoffending rates amongst women who have used them have show a reduction of 5%. But if we are to lean on women's centres, we also need to get behind them. We must ensure they offer a consistently high standard of care across the country and are joined up with the criminal justice system, so referrals are made and best practice is shared. And with this in mind, my lords, I was greatly impressed by the government's proposals to pilot 5 new residential centres. 24/7 support of this nature might well help women at their most vulnerable, and I asked the Minister whether these pilots include provision for women with infants who might also benefit from support at this crucial time. Overall, I believe we should be doing more to support women who are caught up in the criminal justice system or on the verge of being so, especially those with dependents, through women's centres or other schemes. Give them and their families support in the community where we can. Try to keep them out of prison in the first place, but support them if we fail, so that we try to break the destructive cycle for their sakes, for their families, and for society as a whole.
My lords, let me thank the noble Lord Bishop of Gloucester for securing this debate, and may I add my congratulations to Baroness Setter for her excellent maiden contribution. My lords, at any one time we are told that there are 4,000 women in prisons. What we are not told about, that the number of women in prison has doubled since 1993. Most of these women are not serious offenders. Statistics available are very frightening. More than half of those receive sentences of 6 months or less, shorter sentences. More than 1/3 of them had no previous convictions. A substantial number are in prison for non-violent offences. Around a quarter of the women imprisoned each year are jailed for shoplifting. Women in prisons, my lord, typically have a wide range of serious welfare problems. Imprisoned women are 5 times more likely to have a mental health problem than women in the general population, with 78% showing signs of psychological disturbance when they enter prison. My lords, I've checked the last available figures and they reflect some serious concern. 75% have used illegal drugs in the 6 months before prison, and 58% have used drugs every day during those 6 months. 37% have previously attempted suicide. Over half of imprisoned women have suffered domestic violence, and 1 in 3 have experienced sexual abuse. My lords, the incidence and to a lesser extent, the nature of crime may vary from place to place and from generation to generation. But crime is something with which all societies have to come to terms in their own particular way. The underlying causes of crime and the effectiveness of punishment and treatments will continue to be debated continuously. We now have ample evidence that over-reliance on prison as a way of dealing with offenders has not helped. My lords, the priority must be given to crime prevention in its broadest sense and to schemes for diverting as many young offenders as possible from the criminal justice system. There is nothing soft about this sort of approach. It is entirely realistic appraisal of the strictly limited contribution courts and prisons can make to reduce crimes. My lords, equally as a society, we should be aiming to send fewer people to prison. My lords, there was a strong message of the review by Baroness Colston, and I'm delighted with her contribution today, of vulnerable women in the criminal justice system. Her report said, and I quote, "Community solutions for non-violent women offenders should be the norm. There must be a strong, consistent message right from the top of the government with full reasons given in support of a stated policy that prison is not the right place for women offenders who pose no risk to the public." My lords, we should endorse this principle backed by many appeal court judgments, and this is something that should be in every court in this country, that the court should send to prisons only those whose offending make any other course unacceptable, and those who are sent to prison should not stay there any longer than is strictly necessary. My lords, in the last week's debate on rehabilitation, secured by Lord Budd, we are clear that one of the prime concerns of a prison is to prepare inmates for their eventual release. Prisons have a poor record for reducing reoffending, and nearly half of adults are reconvicted within 1 year of release. The record for women is not inspiring. 48% of women are reconvicted within 1 year of leaving prison. Short prison sentences, as has been repeated by almost every speaker, are less effective than community sentences at reducing reoffending. My Lord's, public confidence is shaped by the quality of service that our prison can provide. Recent reports on our prisons are a matter of serious concern. Locking inmates for a long period of time on a daily basis is unlikely to build the confidence that is necessary in achieving an effective process of rehabilitation. The number of prisoners in our institution, the lack of resources required to maintain decent standards in prison calls out for a strategy to look at alternatives to the slogan that prison work. They do not, my Lord. My Lord, the government's commitment to seeking community solution for most women's offending is very welcome. However, the limited resources allocated to support Women's Centre and a lack of timetable to drive progress remain a matter of serious concern. My Lords, establishing a network of women's community projects with adequate funding from the Minister of Justice is a way forward. These projects are run by a voluntary organisation in partnership with the Probation Service. They operate as one-stop shop centres, providing a range of services, and they have proved highly effective in keeping women out of custody by providing the support and help they need to avoid reoffending. Many women have been referred to the projects since they were established. The analysis of the help provided is for all of us to see. Many needed help with counselling and behavioural needs. Help is provided on matters of health, accommodation, employment and training, finance and debts, drug control, alcohol and children and family issues. A good proportion needed support in connection with experiences of abuse, rape or domestic violence. I hope no obstacles will be placed in the way this work is carried out. But my Lord, one of the successes by the government has been the establishment of the Youth Justice Board, and I'm delighted my colleague, Noble Lord McNally, was at one time chairman of this particular institute. The Noble Lord Ramsbottom has advocated similar arrangement for Women's Justice Board. We were told that the reason why we do not have a separate framework in law for women is because we have a different structure for them. I trust that the Minister would look at this matter again to see if such a board can be established. My Lord, this does not marginalize women in the criminal justice system. Instead, we mainstream the provision that we give women and ensure that under the National Offenders Management Structure, ample priority is given to service provision for and management of women offenders.
My Lords, I begin in perhaps unusually complimentary and congratulatory terms to commend the brilliant maiden speech, if I may say so, of the noble Lady Baroness Sater. We very much look forward to hearing from her, and I'm sure we will many times. It was a really inspiring speech. But, my Lords, I must also congratulate the Right Reverend Prelate, of course, for securing this day, this very timely debate, following as it does quite quickly upon the publication of the government strategy launched in June, which clearly does indicate that the government is taking seriously the issues which have been raised and which we are debating tonight. Lord Farmer, of course, reviewed the strengthening of male offenders' family ties in a report last year, and we very much look forward to his further report on the needs of women in the criminal justice system. My Lords, the strategy now published revealed much troubling information about women prisoners. For example, and shockingly, self-harm by women prisoners was 5 times that of males, and the prevalence of anxiety was also greater. 49% of women prisoners need mental health treatment, as against 18% of men, while in Manchester, 91% were assessed as having multiple needs, and 60% had suffered domestic violence. Around 30% have dependent children, on whom the impact of their mother's absence must be a matter of great concern, and whose needs must be imposing additional strain on already stretched local authority budgets. Moreover, the average cost of imprisonment is £43,000 a year, as we have heard, 10 times more costly than the cost of women's centres. The role of women's centres is recognised by the government, and in turn the centres welcome much of the strategy, in particular the intention to reduce reliance on imprisonment, the recognition of the importance of services in the community, and the need to address the problems of black, Asian and ethnic minority women in particular. But there is concern that the financial provision envisaged falls well short of what the voluntary sector will need if lasting change is to be effected. There are 3 areas identified in the strategy which the sector welcomes. The first is early intervention to reduce the number of women drawn into the criminal justice system, including, among other approaches, by funding community provision and domestic abuse services, diverting offenders from the criminal justice system, and supporting the police to work with vulnerable women. The second is an emphasis on community-based solutions. These will include ensuring courts have better information about female offenders for sentencing purposes and developing options for managing women in the community by piloting women's centres. It's quite unclear what the government intends in relation to the latter, and perhaps the noble and early Lord the Minister could enlighten us, if not today, then by letter. It suggested that 5 residential centres should be set up, as we've heard, with local partners, including community rehabilitation companies, whose future is somewhat in doubt at the moment. Given the concerns about the performance of the latter and about potential profit-making providers, such an approach would be likely to be controversial. There is, however, support for what is described as, and I quote, a more gender-informed probation service, and perhaps the noble Lord could explain what this implies. The decision to abandon the commitment to building new community prisons has been welcomed, as has the intention to improve the custodial environment. However, the Advisory Board on Female Offenders, which the government established to advise on sentencing, custodial and probation services for women, has said that £20 million is needed to meet the government's objectives, but only £5 million has been allocated. They ask, reasonably, why the £50 million originally allocated to build 5 new community prisons not now to be built has not been allocated to fund the new policy. It seems to me a perfectly fair question. The Centre for Social Justice report in March made 10 recommendations. Time doesn't permit me to supply detail of all of them, but they included a greater role for police and crime commissioners. Perhaps the noble Lord could undertake to write to members with details of the government's response to those recommendations, and in particular about the involvement of police and crime commissioners. Crucially, however, the Centre's report contained a section on women's centres and identifying their effectiveness, but significantly asserting that despite this evidence, and I quote, their future remains uncertain, not helped by commissioning and contracting arrangements that fall foul of basic market stewardship principles. They conclude, and again I quote, these arrangements significantly and negatively impact on the ability of the centres to plan or provide meaningful job security for employees. They add that as of 2016, the All-Party Parliamentary Group of Women in the Penal System warned of a risk that such centres would be a thing of the past unless action is taken, and that the current number of centres is severely limited, with 45 in operation and large parts of the country without any such provision. So what assurances can the noble Lord the Minister give us about existing centres and their funding, and what steps does he envisage the government taking to extend the provision of such centres to those areas which lack them? There is no doubt that these organisations can make a huge difference. I have personal knowledge of the Anna Wim Centre in Birmingham, referred to by the Noble and Reverend Prelate, through a friend of mine, a former Birmingham magistrate, who was very much involved with it. This centre supports around 700 women a year, with a staff of 35, and deals with a range of services, from prison contact, street outreach, liaison and diversion, family needs, complex needs, mental health, domestic and sexual violence. It has living accommodation, opened by my noble friend Baroness Corson, who herself, of course, has done so much in this area of the justice system and who spoke so movingly this evening. My Lords, the work of the Centre can best be summed up by the woman who wrote to Alla Wim, and I quote again, "I honestly owe my life to Alla Wim. Without you, I wouldn't be here." We need more Alla Wims and organisations like them in a justice system which is adequately funded and able to help women who have committed offences to rebuild their lives, bring up their children, and contribute to a society which recognises their needs and is willing to help the process of rehabilitation. And we need more interest in this issue from male members of this House, who are manifestly underrepresented in the chamber for this debate, which tells a story in its own right.
My Lords, first of all, I would like to add my congratulations to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, for securing this debate. I would also like to thank all noble lords, whatever their gender, for their contributions to this important debate. And of course, I would particularly wish to note the contribution of my noble friend, Baroness Sater, who clearly is eminently qualified to make a contribution by way of her maiden speech in this debate, and I look forward to her further contributions in this House. I would also like to thank the noble lady Baroness Corsten for coming to speak to me, and I'm grateful for her having shared her knowledge and experience in this area with me. I'm equally grateful for her not having shared her severe cold with me, but I hope she's recovering. My Lords, various statistics have been noted, but clearly we understand that although far fewer women are represented in the criminal justice system, those who are there and who come into contact with the criminal justice system are amongst some of the most vulnerable women in society. Many face complex circumstances, including histories of abuse, mental health issues, low income, unstable accommodation, and of course, in many, many cases, the experience of domestic violence and the disruption which that engenders. And it is a recognition of this vulnerability and indeed need that underpins our female offender strategy, which was published in June. And I would pause to acknowledge the work of my honourable friend, Philip Lee, in respect of that matter. Our strategy sets out the government's intent for improving outcomes for women in contact with the justice system, based on a vision that fewer women should come into the criminal justice system, fewer women should come into custody, and fewer women should especially come into custody for short-term sentences. We do want to see a greater proportion of women managed in the community, and we want to see them managed successfully. And we want to see better conditions for women who, for safety or other reasons, need to be held in custody. If we are to achieve the aims of such a strategy, then we must recognise that community services lie at the heart of our approach. We know that the third sector-led women's centres can offer valuable support to help vulnerable women address their needs and turn their lives around, thereby reducing the risk of reoffending. And examples have been given by a number of your noble lordships. Indeed, women's centres are often at the heart of the multi-agency whole-system approach to female offenders. These aim to provide holistic, gender-informed support to women from first contact with the police and at all points of the justice system. And I refer to gender-informed support, and the noble Lord Beecham raised the question of gender-informed probation services, and that is a matter of training and experience. It's a matter of ensuring that those engaged in the provision of probation services understand the particular and peculiar needs of women in the justice system. And certainly that is something that we aim to ensure going forward. The Right Reverend Prelate has asked what assessment has been made of the ability of women's centres to improve outcomes for women in the justice system. Now, it would be difficult to undertake a full assessment, as women's centres offer support to women with a wide range of issues and needs, not all of whom have been referred by or indeed have come into contact with the criminal justice system. And we also know that women may be supported by other local agencies. We estimate that there are approximately 80 women's centres in England and Wales. More than 50 of these support women in the criminal justice system, with over 30 being engaged with community rehabilitation company contracts. And I notice the comments that have been made about some of the difficulties surrounding those contracts and those engagements. Noble Lords will be aware that we are addressing the issue of existing CRC contracts. They are intended to be terminated and reviewed going forward. And it is our intention to seek to ensure that going forward, the community rehabilitation companies understand the need to engage with the voluntary sector, and in particular these centres, as part of their supply chain. Data from some centres has clearly found the way in which they have been effective. Women supported by women's centres, contracted to CRCs, have clearly a lower reoffending rate than those who have no contact with these centres. Data from the Brighton Women's Centre found that for every 100 women supported by the centre, there was a reduction in the frequency of reoffending by between 27 and 29 offences. Alongside the work that women's centres do, there are many other community services that are effective in supporting the complex needs of female offenders. And as set out in our strategy, we are encouraging local areas to adopt new ways of working by developing a multi-agency, often termed whole system, approach to these issues. And the whole system model brings, or we hope will bring together local agencies, criminal justice, and both statutory and voluntary organisations. And together they should be capable of providing the sort of targeted support that female offenders need. And that has to be complemented by the National Probation Service and community rehabilitation companies, who are clearly going to be key partners in ensuring that female offenders receive targeted support, not only through the gate, but once they're back in the community. Now, to give an example, the whole system approach set up in Greater Manchester in 2014 has provided effective outcomes for female offenders. And we know, however, that the availability of women's community services across England and Wales does not always match the demand for those services. And we do want to see a sustainable network of women's community services and centres embedded as an integral partner in the delivery of public services for female offenders, making better use of their potential as places where support and interventions can be delivered in an appropriate form and at an appropriate time. Clearly, such a network cannot be delivered without funding. We know that women's centres have a wide range of funding streams, that they often face issues of sustainability, creating uncertainty for staff and putting services at risk. If we are to deliver the commitments in our strategy, we need to ensure that we have sustainable community provision that will meet demand. And that is why the strategy announced the investment of £5 million of cross-government funding over 2 years in community provision. As part of this investment, we have launched an initial £3.5 million grant funding competition for 2018-2019 and 2019-2020 to sustain and increase community provision, including whole system approach models for female offenders. And this community provision is intended to include women's centres. And we hope that this funding will also help providers to leverage additional funding from other sources. Now, some concerns have been raised at the level of this funding, which of course builds on the £1 million seed funding that we are investing in the whole system approaches between 2016 and 2020. But the government is committed to ensuring that there is sufficient funding for the female offender strategy, and this is the start of a new and significant programme of work to deliver better outcomes. And we will have the opportunity to revisit funding issues as we take that work forward. We know that a truly sustainable network of community provision requires the support and involvement of many partners, and not just of government. And our strategy therefore announced that we will work across government and with other partners to develop and agree a national Concordat on female offenders. And this will set out a cross-government approach to addressing the needs of this cohort of vulnerable women. Importantly, it will also seek to provide the leadership that stakeholders tell us is necessary to bring about change at the local level. The Concordat will act as a statement of intent, agreement and understanding about how statutory and third sector services should come together to provide what I would term a joined-up response to supporting vulnerable women in this context. And through early intervention, we want to see fewer women coming into the justice system. For those women who do offend, we want to provide support from first contact with the police and at all stages of the justice system so that we can effectively address the factors that lie beneath their offending behaviour and thereby reduce the risk of reoffending. It is, of course, important to acknowledge that women's centres must be supported in their work with female offenders' lives by an effective probation system. A probation system which sees offenders regularly, identifies their particular rehabilitative needs, and secures access for them to the right forms of support. And it is vital equally that courts have confidence in the probation services delivering those services in order that they can give proper consideration to effective community sentences as distinct from custodial sentences. And we also recognise that the probation system needs to improve. And we are taking decisive action to stabilise and improve the delivery of probation services by setting out our intention to end the current CRC contracts early and put in place new arrangements, as I mentioned, from 2020. And we are consulting on our proposals and look forward to hearing the views of a range of stakeholders, including how probation services can best meet the needs of female offenders. Alongside that, we want to explore what more we can do to improve outcomes for female offenders, and the strategy has committed us to working with local and national partners to develop a residential women's centre pilot in at least 5 centres in England and Wales. And through the pilot, we hope to develop a robust evidence base about what could be an effective, sustainable and scalable model for improving outcomes for female offenders.